My husband said, "I sold your little cottage for $85,000. His mother raised her glass. His father called it finally taking initiative. He looked at me across the table and said, "Your parents have been gone 4 years. Sentimental real estate is still real estate." I said nothing. My phone was already buzzing in my pocket. It was the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. And they were already at the buyer's lawyer's office. The Hartley family dinner table had always operated like a courtroom where the verdict was decided before anyone walked in. That Thursday evening in October, the dining room of Derek's parents' house in Oakville smelled like Patricia's signature pot roast and something else I couldn't name until much later. Anticipation. They had been waiting for me to arrive. I had driven directly from Pearson Airport, my suitcase still in the trunk of my car, 5 days of Vancouver conference clothes still folded inside. The flight delay out of YVR had pushed my arrival back by 2 hours, which meant I'd missed whatever opening act they had planned. When I walked through Patricia's front door, the table was already set. The good china. The crystal that only came out for Christmas and what she called milestone occasions. Gordon was pouring wine he had clearly selected for the moment rather than the meal. Derek stood at the head of the table. Not his usual spot. That was Gordon's chair. The fact that Gordon had yielded it told me everything about whose victory this was supposed to be. Let me go back to the beginning, because the cottage didn't begin with Derek. It began with my parents. My mother and father had immigrated from Hong Kong to Toronto in the late 1980s. They had worked their entire lives in ways that left very little room for anything resembling leisure. My father ran a dry cleaning business in Scarborough for 22 years. My mother kept the books and raised me and my brothers simultaneously. The kind of multitasking that deserves its own national holiday. They were not the kind of people who took vacations to Muskoka. That world felt like it belonged to someone else's Canada. But when my father retired, something shifted. He had been reading about the lakes north of the city his entire adult life, the way people read about places they assume they'll never go. One spring weekend, on a whim that was entirely unlike him, he drove us 3 hours north on Highway 11 and turned down a dirt road outside of Huntsville that ended at a lake, so still it looked painted. The property was modest by Muskoka standards. A cedar-sided cottage built in the 70s, a narrow dock extending into the water, 2 bedrooms and a screened porch that sagged slightly on the south end. The previous owner had been an older man named Harold Sinclair who had spent 30 summers there and was moving to be closer to his children in Halifax. He priced it below market because, he told my father over the phone, he wanted it to go to someone who would love it the same way he had. My father paid for it entirely in cash. He had spent decades saving with the specific discipline of someone who had arrived with nothing and intended to leave something behind. The deed was placed in a family trust that our estate lawyer, a meticulous woman named Barbara Tran, who my mother had found through their community, structured specifically to protect the property from probate complications. I was named the sole trustee. My brother David was the secondary beneficiary. Barbara had explained clearly, in the kind of plain language that made her exceptional at her job, that no transaction involving the trust property could proceed without my written and notarized authorization. My parents spent 7 summers at that cottage. 7 summers of my father learning to fish badly and refusing to admit it. 7 summers of my mother growing tomatoes in containers on the dock because she said the lake light made them sweeter. I drove up every long weekend I could manage, sleeping on the screened porch even after the air turned cold in September, listening to loons that sounded like the wilderness was clearing its throat. My father died of a cardiac event in the spring, 3 weeks after his 69th birthday. My mother followed 18 months later, a stroke that took her quietly while she slept. The estate settled without complication because of Barbara's planning. The cottage passed to the trust intact. I drove up alone that first summer after losing them both, sat on the dock for an entire afternoon, and decided that whatever else happened in my life, I was keeping that property. Derek had been in my life for 4 years by then. We had married the previous autumn in a small ceremony at a venue in Dundas, the kind of wedding that felt intimate because we had kept the guest list under 60 people. His family had made it clear, in ways that felt like diplomacy but functioned like pressure, that they found the guest count understated. Patricia had lobbied for the Paletta estate. I had said no. That should have told me more than it did. Derek worked in enterprise software sales. He was good at it in the way that charming people are good at things that require charm. He made decent money, spent more of it than he made, and treated financial planning the way some people treat exercise, something he fully intended to start taking seriously next month. When he discovered, 6 months into our marriage, that I had a Muskoka property that wasn't on our joint asset disclosure, his reaction moved through surprise and into something that felt more territorial than I was willing to name at the time. "You just didn't mention it," he said, which wasn't a question. "It's in a family trust," I said. "It's not a marital asset. Barbara set it up specifically that way." He nodded slowly in the way that means someone has filed information away rather than accepted it. The pattern with his family established itself gradually. Patricia had opinions about how I maintained the cottage, despite never having visited. She forwarded articles about the carrying costs of rural Ontario properties, about the property tax increases in Muskoka district, about a woman in Barrie who had been overwhelmed by a cottage inheritance and eventually sold at a loss. Gordon made comments at family dinners about sentimental real estate versus smart investment. Derek's brother Ryan referred to it once as that shack up north within earshot and didn't apologize when I heard him. When Derek asked if they could use the cottage for a Hartley family week in July, I said yes. I thought it might help. It didn't. Patricia rearranged my mother's kitchen, replacing her labeled spice containers with a generic rack from Canadian Tire. Gordon repainted the dock without asking, choosing a color I would have never chosen, and declared it an improvement. Ryan's girlfriend Melissa posted photos to her Instagram with the caption, "Hartley Family Cottage Summer," as if the possessive had simply transferred by osmosis. I drove up the weekend after they left and spent 2 days quietly restoring what I could. I didn't say anything to Derek about it. I had learned, by then, that raising concerns about his family with Derek was like reporting a problem to the department responsible for creating it. The assignment in Vancouver came in August. I worked as a compliance officer for a mid-sized asset management firm headquartered in Toronto's financial district. A regulatory conference hosted by the BC Securities Commission required our firm to send senior representation, and I was the senior representation. 5 days, September 23rd to 27th. I arranged everything before I left: the automated payments on my accounts, a text to the Huntsville property management company I had been using since my parents passed, and a folder on the kitchen counter for Derek with emergency contacts and a copy of the trust documentation, clearly marked, in case anyone asked about the cottage for any reason. Derek laughed at the folder. "It's a cottage, not a nuclear facility," he said. I noticed he didn't actually look at what was inside it. Vancouver was the kind of work trip that reminds you why you chose your career. The sessions were substantive. My presentation on beneficial ownership transparency drew follow-up questions for 40 minutes. My colleague from the Montreal office texted me after that she had heard 3 separate people mention my name in the hallway. I walked along the seawall that evening and felt, for the first time in months, like a version of myself I actually recognized. Derek called twice in the first week. By the second week, the calls had dropped to texts. Short ones. "Busy. Talk later." His Instagram, however, showed no shortage of availability. Dinner at a steakhouse in Mississauga with Ryan. A Blue Jays game with Gordon. A gathering at Patricia's that the caption described as "whole family together," a photograph in which the empty chair beside Derek was occupied not by an absence but by Melissa, positioned with the easy comfort of someone who had been there many times before. I noticed. I had been noticing for longer than I had been willing to admit. I landed at Pearson on the evening of September 27th. Derek had not offered to pick me up, citing what he described as back-to-back calls. I took an Uber. When I texted to say I was 20 minutes out, he replied that dinner was at his parents' and I should come straight there. Not a question. A scheduling update, like I was a package being rerouted. I changed in the airport bathroom. Blazer over the blouse I'd worn on the plane. I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment and thought, whatever is about to happen, do not give them the satisfaction of seeing you react. Patricia's dining room was lit the way she lit it for important occasions. The chandelier on full, the candles on the sideboard burning, the good tablecloth that she dry cleaned herself and stored in tissue paper between uses. Gordon was in his golf blazer. Ryan had gotten a haircut. Melissa was there, seated in a chair that had, for the past 2 years of dinners, been mine. Derek stood at the head of the table in Gordon's chair. He was wearing the shirt I had given him for his birthday, the one he said he was saving for something special. He looked at me when I walked in with the expression of someone who has rehearsed the moment and is pleased with how it's landing. "There she is," Patricia said, with warmth, that didn't reach her eyes. Perfect timing. Derek has wonderful news. I sat in the chair that had been left for me, at the far end of the table, and I folded my hands in my lap and I waited. Derek lifted his glass. While Claire was away in Vancouver, I took care of something I've been meaning to handle for a while. He paused, letting the room's attention settle on him. Claire's parents' cottage has been sitting underutilized for 4 years. The carrying costs, the property taxes in Muskoka, the maintenance, it made no sense financially. I found a buyer. A developer out of Barrie who wanted the lake frontage. I closed the deal 3 weeks ago. $85,000. The room responded exactly as he had wanted it to. Gordon set down his fork and began to nod slowly, the nod of a man recognizing a decision he would have made himself. Patricia pressed her hand to her chest and called it sensible. Ryan said finally under his breath, as though this had been a long-standing grievance resolved. Melissa looked at me with an expression of careful neutrality. Derek turned to me. Your parents have been gone 4 years. Sentimental real estate is still real estate. He gestured toward the spread on the table, the wine, the roast, the dishes Patricia had clearly taken effort over. I thought we'd celebrate. The money's going into our investment account. Ryan has a business opportunity he's been working on. I did not speak. I was aware of my phone vibrating in my pocket, a persistent buzzing that I had silenced on the drive over. I was also aware of something else, a stillness inside myself that I had not expected to feel. Not shock. Not even anger, exactly. Something closer to the moment when a very long equation finally produces a clean result. You're quiet, Patricia observed, the way she always observed my silences as evidence of a character flaw she had identified years ago. I'm processing, I said. My phone buzzed again. I reached into my pocket and glanced at the screen under the table. It was a number I recognized: Sergeant Dana Kowalski, RCMP, Financial Crimes, Toronto Division. We had been introduced at a compliance networking event 14 months earlier. I excused myself from the table with the kind of quiet efficiency that Derek had always interpreted as my inability to handle conflict. I stepped into Patricia's hallway, past the framed photos of Derek at every age, past the shelf of commemorative plates she collected from places she'd been, and through the door to the backyard patio where the October air was cold enough to feel clarifying. Sergeant Kowalski, I said. Miss Chen. She used my maiden name, which I had legally kept for professional purposes. I apologize for the late hour. Are you available to speak? We've had a situation develop this evening that involves a property registered to your family trust. I stood on Patricia's back patio and listened as she explained what had already been set in motion before I had even landed at Pearson. The Ontario Land Registry had flagged the transfer. Under the trust documentation Barbara Tran had filed, any property transaction required notarized trustee authorization, mine, plus notification to the secondary beneficiary, my brother David. The developer's lawyer, processing the registration, had submitted paperwork bearing my signature on documents dated during the period I had been in Vancouver. The signature had cleared an initial automated review, but a manual audit triggered by the trust flag had identified discrepancies. The RCMP had been contacted by the Land Registry office that morning. They had spent the day collecting documents from the buyer's legal team. The signature on the authorization form is a forgery, Sergeant Kowalski said plainly. We have 3 handwriting samples from your professional records for comparison. The variance is significant. Through the glass door, I could see the dining room. Derek was filling glasses. His father was leaning forward in the posture of a man being told something he wants to hear. Ryan was already on his phone, probably texting about the business opportunity that was, apparently, funded by a property he had no legal claim to. I'm at my in-laws' house, I said. Derek is inside. A pause. Are you safe? Yes. He doesn't know I know anything yet. Another pause. Then I'd encourage you to return to dinner, Miss Chen. Be natural. Our officers are approximately 25 minutes from your current location. We have confirmation that all relevant parties are present. I put my phone back in my pocket, adjusted my blazer, and walked back through the door. Everything okay? Melissa asked as I sat down. Work, I said. It follows me everywhere. Derek laughed. That's because you let it. I smiled. I ate. I answered Patricia's questions about Vancouver with the appropriate level of detail. I watched Derek describe, to Ryan, how he had handled the transaction entirely himself. He explained how he had located the buyer through a contact of Gordon's. How he had pulled comparable sales data from Muskoka district properties with lake frontage. How he had managed the entire process without using a realtor, saving the commission. How he had found my notarized signature samples in the filing cabinet in our home office, the one I kept locked but whose combination was, apparently, not as private as I had believed. Took me about a week to get it right, he said, with the pride of someone describing a craft project. The tricky part was the trust authorization form. Her signature on legal documents is different from her everyday signature. More deliberate. He demonstrated in the air with his finger, the arc of letters he had practiced until they matched. Gordon called it resourcefulness. Patricia called it taking charge. Ryan asked when the money would clear so he could confirm the timeline for his business partner. I watched the clock on Patricia's kitchen wall. When headlights swept across the dining room curtains, not one set but three, moving in deliberate sequence across the front of the house, I was the only person at the table who didn't look surprised. Patricia frowned toward the window. Who would be visiting at this hour? The doorbell rang before she finished the sentence. I was already standing. I'll get it. Sergeant Dana Kowalski stood on Patricia's front step with 4 other officers behind her, all of them in plainclothes but carrying the unmistakable presence of people who had done this before. She looked exactly, as I remembered from the compliance event, precise, unhurried, the kind of person whose competence you recognize immediately. Miss Chen, she said. Are all parties present? Dining room, I said. They're having dessert. She nodded once and moved through the door. I stepped aside and followed them in. The officers spread through Patricia's dining room with an efficiency that made her furniture look suddenly impermanent. Derek's fork paused. Gordon's color changed. Ryan pushed back from the table as though there was somewhere to go. Derek Hartley. Sergeant Kowalski's voice filled the room without effort. She produced her badge RCMP, the crest catching Patricia's chandelier light. I'm placing you under arrest for fraud over $5,000, forgery of a document, and breach of trust under the Criminal Code of Canada. Patricia's wine glass did not fall. She set it down with tremendous care, as though if she could control this one thing, the rest might still be stopped. Derek stood. His chair scraped back against Patricia's hardwood floor. This is insane. It was a real estate transaction. A family decision. Selling trust property using forged trustee authorization is not a real estate transaction, Mr. Hartley. Sergeant Kowalski moved toward him without hurry. It's a federal offense. She's my wife. His voice had shifted into something between anger and the beginning of panic. We share everything. I had every right to. The property was held in an irrevocable family trust of which Miss Chen was the sole trustee. You had no signing authority. You forged her signature on Federal Land Registry documents. She paused. The handwriting analysis alone is sufficient. The fact that you explained your forgery process in detail to your family at this dinner table is additionally helpful. One of the other officers was already documenting the table, photographing the remains of the celebration meal, the wine glasses, the good china, the occasion that had been orchestrated to announce a theft as a triumph. Derek turned to me. He looked at me the way he had looked at me for 4 years, whenever he wanted something with the expectation that I would provide it. Tell them this is a misunderstanding. Tell them I was acting in our interests. Tell them. I met his eyes. I had spent 4 years in this family measuring every word before I spoke it. Hedging every accomplishment, softening every boundary. The silence I gave him now was not the silence of a woman without a voice. It was the silence of a woman who had finally decided her voice was too valuable to waste. Gordon attempted to stand, and one of the officers asked him, with professional politeness, to remain seated. Gordon sat. He looked suddenly like a much older man than he had at the start of dinner. Mr. and Mrs. Hartley Sr., Sergeant Kowalski said, turning to Derek's parents. We'll need you both to come in for questioning tomorrow morning. Your names appear in communications with the buyer's legal team, and there are questions about your role in facilitating the introduction to the developer. Patricia's hand went to her pearls. We simply made an introduction. We had no idea. That will be for investigators to determine. Ryan had gone completely still in his chair. Melissa had her phone out but wasn't looking at it, as though she had decided any movement might draw attention. I watched Derek's hands being guided behind his back. I watched the cuffs close. I watched the moment, his certainty, the particular kind of certainty that comes from never once having been held accountable for anything, finally met something it couldn't charm its way past. The next morning, I sat in the offices of Barbara Tran's firm on Bay Street and answered every question she and her team asked with the care I brought to every compliance review I had ever conducted. Barbara had pulled the full trust documentation within 20 minutes of my call the night before. She had contacted David in Calgary to ensure he was informed. She had 3 decades of estate law experience and the expression of someone who was deeply unsurprised by what I was describing. The trust held, I told her. It was designed to, she said. That's what trusts are for. The investigation moved with a thoroughness that the Hartley family had clearly never anticipated. What began as a fraud charge against Derek expanded quickly. The RCMP forensic accountants, working with documents subpoenaed from our joint accounts, uncovered a pattern of transfers going back 2.5 years. Money from my paycheck deposits redirected before I had reviewed the month statements. Small amounts, $400 here, $800 there, that individually looked like ordinary expenses, until you saw them mapped across 28 months of banking records. The total was over $60,000, moved into accounts I had never known existed, spent on things I had never been consulted about. A trip to Whistler I was told was a sales conference, a watch purchased on our joint Visa card that I had assumed was a client gift. Payments to Melissa's Venmo account. Starting 11 months before I went to Vancouver. I had suspected the Melissa piece for longer than I admitted to myself. Knowing it officially, with bank records attached, felt less like a wound and more like a diagnostic result. It explained the shape of what I had been living inside, even if it didn't make the living less exhausting in retrospect. The developer who had purchased the Cottage, a company out of Barrie called Lakeside Meridian Capital, initiated civil proceedings against Derek's lawyer, the title insurance company, and the conveyancing firm that had processed the transaction. Their legal team had failed to verify trust authorization despite the flag in the land registry system. 3 real estate professionals who had assisted Derek with comparable sales data and staging advice faced their own regulatory reviews through the Real Estate Council of Ontario. One of them, a woman who had posted on LinkedIn about facilitating a successful Muskoka transaction, found her license under review within 6 weeks. Gordon and Patricia faced charges of counseling fraud. The emails between Gordon and the developer's contact, establishing the introduction and discussing the property's value without my knowledge, were sufficient for the Crown attorney to proceed. Their lawyer argued they were simply parents who had trusted their son. The Crown's position was that a reasonable person, receiving communications about selling property they knew belonged to their daughter-in-law, bore responsibility for what followed. Patricia's Facebook post from 3 weeks before the dinner, so proud of Derek for finally taking control of the family's finances, someone has to, did not help their case. Ryan cooperated immediately. Faced with the prospect of conspiracy charges for his knowing acceptance of proceeds from the fraudulent sale, he provided a full account of every family conversation he had witnessed about the cottage, about my finances, about the plan Derek had developed over the course of more than a year. His cooperation was detailed and, from what the Crown attorney described to me, genuinely useful. In exchange, he received a conditional discharge and 80 hours of community service. His business venture, which had been scheduled to receive $50,000 of the cottage sale proceeds, never launched. Melissa's involvement had been limited enough that she faced no criminal exposure, but the civil proceedings named her as a recipient of funds in the context of the broader financial fraud claim. She had retained her own counsel by the time the process server found her. I did not follow what happened to her after that. It wasn't my concern. Derek's case took 8 months from arrest to sentencing. The Ontario Court of Justice, Criminal Division. The judge was a methodical man named Justice Raymond Cho, who had the energy of someone who had heard every variation of Derek's particular argument before. Derek's lawyer argued that the complexity of trust law, the ambiguity of marital property, the lack of malicious intent. Justice Cho listened to all of it with the patience of a person waiting for a timer to go off. Mr. Hartley, he said, when it was finally time, the evidence in this case does not describe a man confused about trust law. It describes a man who researched the property, identified the documentation, practiced the signature, executed the forgery, arranged the sale, collected the funds, and then invited his family to celebrate. The planning is not a mitigating factor. It is the offense. The sentence was 2 years less a day, served conditionally in the community for the first 12 months, followed by federal supervision. Restitution of $140,000 covering the value of the cottage, the diverted funds, and the legal costs associated with the trust's recovery. A criminal record that would follow him through every future employment application, every professional license, every border crossing for the rest of his working life. The divorce proceeded through our respective lawyers with a speed that surprised me until my lawyer explained that cases involving criminal financial fraud against a spouse tend to resolve without the usual negotiations. Ontario family law is not sentimental about the division of assets when one party has spent years stealing from the other. The matrimonial home, the joint accounts, the investments all assessed with the fraudulently diverted funds factored in as a debt he owed to the marriage, not an asset he had contributed. I walked out of the process with more than I had walked in with, which was not justice so much as arithmetic. The cottage came back to the trust intact. The sale had never completed from a legal standpoint. The forged authorization invalidated the transaction at the land registry level, and the developer's civil case against the other parties ensured the property returned to its original status. Lakeside Meridian Capital received their $85,000 back, plus damages, from Derek's lawyer and the conveyancing firm's malpractice insurer. I drove up in November, the weekend after the divorce was finalized. The property management company had maintained everything through the chaos of the preceding months. The dock was in, winched up for winter, the way my father used to do it every October with a methodical care that I had filmed once on my phone and still sometimes watched. The pipes had been drained, the screens stored, the fireplace cleaned. I built a fire that first evening and sat in front of it until the pine logs burned down to coals. My mother's labeled spice containers were still gone, replaced by Patricia's generic rack, and I stood in the kitchen for a long time deciding what I felt about that before removing every unfamiliar thing from the shelf and driving it to the Huntsville thrift store the next morning. I ordered replacements online, small glass jars with chalkboard labels, and spent an afternoon filling them with cinnamon and cumin and the dried lemongrass she used to buy at the T&T in Scarborough. I called my brother David from the dock on my second morning there. The lake was silver in the early light, the kind of November morning where the cold makes everything exact. He had followed the case from Calgary with a restraint that I had always found characteristic of him, not uninvolved, but trusting me to handle it, available when I needed him. We talked for an hour. He asked when he could visit. I told him to come in the summer. I told him to bring his kids so they could learn to fish badly like Baba had. And to refuse to admit it. Barbara Tran sent me a note after the criminal sentencing. Handwritten, on her firm's letterhead. "Your parents built that trust carefully," she wrote. "It did exactly what they designed it to do." I read it twice and kept it. The work in compliance continued. My managing director had followed the case. It was not possible not to, given the media coverage, which had been considerable. His response was not pity but the particular professional respect that comes from watching someone navigate a catastrophe without losing their footing. My caseload expanded. My rate increased. I started consulting independently on weekends, the kind of work that travels easily to a screened porch overlooking a lake, into a desk positioned by a window where the morning light comes in over the water in exactly the way I imagine my father described when he called my mother on that first Tuesday in October, standing in the middle of Ruth Sinclair's driveway, saying, "I found it. I think I found it." There is a thing people say about quiet people, which is that their silence means they have nothing to say. I had lived inside that misreading for 4 years, and before that I had watched my parents live inside it for the whole of their lives in this country, the assumption that stillness was absence, that patience was passivity, that a person who did not demand to be seen was a person willing to be overlooked. The Hartley family had built their entire understanding of me on that misreading. What they had never accounted for, what Derek had never accounted for, practicing my signature in our home office while I was 2,300 kilometers away, doing the most competent work of my career, was that the quiet is not empty. The quiet is where you keep everything that matters. The documentation. The trust. The plans. The deed in your name, registered with the province, protected by law. Attached to a property on a lake in Muskoka where your father once said the sunrise through the pines was better than anything he had ever seen. The morning light still comes through those trees the same way. I know because I was there to watch it. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button and let me know in the comments what moment hit the hardest. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the Shadowed Bonds. You won't want to miss what's coming next.